Mark never imagined a Tuesday in February would unravel the quiet tapestry of his life. The snow had been falling for 3 days, a silent, relentless siege that had buried the world in a shroud of white. From the window of his small, isolated cabin, the landscape was a masterpiece of monochrome desolation, a sight that usually brought him a sense of profound peace. He had chosen this life, this solitude, after the noise of the world had become too much to bear. Here, the only sounds were the crackle of the fire, the groan of the pines under the weight of the snow, and the howl of the wind, a lonely song he had come to understand. But today, a new element had been added to the composition, a single, dark brush stroke against the canvas of white. A dog. It was far out, near the edge of the frozen creek that marked the boundary of his property, a moving speck of darkness in the vast, unblemished expanse. Strays were not unheard of out here, desperate animals pushed to the fringes by the harshness of winter. Most were fleeting shadows, gone by morning. This one, however, was different. It wasn't foraging. It wasn't seeking shelter under the low-hanging boughs of the firs. It was digging. He watched it for an hour, a cup of coffee growing cold in his hands. The dog, a husky mix by the look of its silhouette, was digging with a frantic, obsessive energy that seemed utterly at odds with the lethargic cold. It would plunge its nose into the snow, then use its paws in a furious, churning motion, sending plumes of white powder into the air. Then it would pause, panting, its breath a cloud of steam in the frigid air, before starting all over again in the exact same spot. Mark's initial assumption was simple, logical. It was digging a snow cave for shelter, a desperate attempt to escape the wind that scoured the open ground. Or perhaps it had scented a rabbit, or a vole burrowed deep beneath the surface, a last-ditch effort for a meal. He felt a familiar pang of detached pity. The wild was cruel, and he was merely a witness to its ancient, unforgiving laws. He finished his coffee, turned from the window, and tried to put the image out of his mind. It was not his struggle. But the image persisted. The dark, frantic shape against the blinding white. Throughout the day, he found his gaze drawn back to the window. The dog had not moved from its spot. The hole it was creating grew deeper, a dark wound in the snow. The animal's movements became slower, more deliberate, yet no less determined. The frantic energy had been replaced by a grim, exhausting perseverance. It was no longer just digging, it was excavating with a purpose that felt chillingly intelligent. By late afternoon, as the low sun cast long, blue shadows across the snow, a deep sense of unease had settled over Mark. This was not the behavior of a hungry animal. A predator would have given up hours ago and moved on. This was not an animal seeking shelter. The spot it had chosen was exposed, offering no protection from the elements. This was something else. An obsession. A vigil. The dog's relentless focus on that single patch of ground felt deeply, unnervingly wrong. He watched as it stumbled, its legs weak with exhaustion, yet it pushed itself back up and resumed its work. Its loyalty to that patch of frozen earth was absolute, a silent testament to a story he couldn't begin to comprehend. He knew, with a certainty that settled like a stone in his gut, that if he did nothing, he would look out his window tomorrow morning and see a dark shape that was no longer moving. The thought was unbearable. The quiet of his world, once a comfort, now felt like a form of complicity. He had come here to escape the world's complications, but the world, it seemed, had sent a messenger to his door. With a sigh that surrendered to the inevitable, he pulled on his heavy winter gear. He grabbed a thermos of hot broth, a thick wool blanket, and a sturdy shovel. He still believed he was going out to help a lost dog dig a den, or perhaps to coax it back to the warmth of his cabin. He had no idea, he was walking toward a revelation that would shatter his heart and rebuild his world. What he was about to uncover beneath the snow was not just a mystery, but a truth so profound it would forever alter the meaning of loyalty, courage, and the silent, unbreakable bonds that connect us all. Stay with us as we uncover the story of this incredible dog, and if you are moved by tales of animal devotion, please consider liking this video and subscribing for more. The snow crunched under Mark's boots, the sound unnaturally loud in the profound silence. Each step was an effort, the deep powder fighting him, pulling at his legs. The cold was a physical presence, a sharp, crystalline thing that burned in his lungs. In the distance, the dog finally stopped its work. It stood, head raised, watching his slow approach. It was a statue carved from shadow and ice, perfectly still, its posture a mixture of exhaustion and wary defiance. As he drew closer, he could see the details that his window had hidden. The dog was beautiful, with the classic markings of a Siberian husky, but it was painfully thin, its ribs a faint outline beneath its thick, matted fur. Its paws, he could now see, were raw and blooded, the pristine snow around its hole stained with small, frozen crimson droplets. It had been digging for so long that it had worn its own flesh away. A low growl rumbled in its chest as Mark stopped about 20 feet away, a sound that was less a threat and more a weary warning. "Easy there," Mark said, his voice soft, carried away almost instantly by the wind. "I'm not going to hurt you. I just want to help." He knelt, placing the thermos and a small bowl on the snow. He unscrewed the cap, and the rich scent of warm chicken broth rose into the frigid air. For a starving animal, it should have been an irresistible lure. He pushed the bowl forward gently. The dog watched the offering, its dark eyes intelligent and unblinking. It glanced at the bowl, then back at Mark, and then, to his utter astonishment, it turned its head away, dismissing the food entirely. It took a half step back, closer to the hole it had guarded so fiercely. This was the moment the situation shifted from puzzling to deeply alarming. A starving stray, expending its last reserves of energy in the brutal cold, had just refused a warm, life-sustaining meal. Hunger was not its motivation. That simple act told Mark that whatever was happening here, it was far outside his understanding of animal instinct. This wasn't about survival in the way he understood it. This was a mission. He stood up slowly, his hands raised in a gesture of peace. "Okay," he whispered, more to himself than to the dog. "Okay. It's not about food," he decided on a different approach. He would try to lure the dog away from this desolate spot and back toward the relative safety of his cabin. "Come on, girl," he said, his voice gentle and coaxing. "Let's go. It's warm back at my place. You can rest." He took a step backward, patting his thigh. The dog just stared, its feet planted. It was an anchor, chained to that spot by an invisible force. It let out a soft whine, a sound of profound distress, and looked from Mark to the hole and back again. The message was clear, transmitted with a certainty that transcended language. "I cannot leave. You don't understand. The answer is here." Mark felt a wave of frustration mixed with a growing, gnawing dread. The animal was going to die out here, fixated on a patch of empty ground. Maybe it had lost its mind to the cold, its brain addled by hypothermia. The most humane thing to do, he reasoned, might be to force it back to the cabin. But as he looked into its eyes, he didn't see madness. He saw a desperate, pleading intelligence. He saw a creature trying with every fiber of its being to communicate a vital, urgent truth. He was the only one here to listen. He let out a long, slow breath, his resolve hardening. If the dog wouldn't leave the hole, then he would have to join it. He picked up his shovel. "All right," he said, his voice now firm, "a promise. You win. Let's see what's so important." He walked to the edge of the pit the dog had dug. It was surprisingly deep already, nearly 3 feet down. The dog watched him, its body tense with anticipation. It didn't growl this time. Instead, it sat, its gaze fixed on the shovel in his hands, a silent, hopeful partner in a task whose purpose Mark could not yet fathom. He plunged the shovel into the snow, and the real work began. The work was brutal. The top layer of snow was powdery and light, but underneath, it was a dense, heavy mass, compacted by its own weight and hardened by the relentless cold. Each shovelful felt like lifting wet cement. Mark was in good shape, accustomed to the physical demands of his solitary life, but this was different. This was a race against a clock he couldn't see. The sun was already touching the jagged peaks of the western mountains, and the temperature was plummeting with alarming speed. Soon, the world would be plunged into a deep, dangerous darkness. He worked in a steady rhythm, digging and tossing, digging and tossing. The dog sat nearby, a silent supervisor. It watched his every move, its head cocked, its breath coming in ragged, steaming pants. Occasionally, it would let out a soft whimper, a sound of encouragement or perhaps impatience. Mark found himself talking to it, the words punctuating the grunts of his exertion. "We're getting there, girl. Don't you worry. We'll find it." Whatever it is, the words were a comfort to him, a way to fill the vast, oppressive silence, a way to convince himself that he wasn't going crazy, digging a hole in the middle of nowhere at the behest of a dog. Hours bled into one another. His muscles burned, and sweat, dangerously, began to prickle his skin beneath his layers of clothing. He had to stop periodically to wipe his brow, the moisture freezing almost instantly on his glove. He was digging into the earth now, the shovel scraping against frozen soil and small rocks. He had cleared an area nearly 10 feet wide, and still, there was nothing. Nothing but snow and frozen ground. A profound sense of futility began to creep in, chilling him more than the wind. He was exhausted, his body screaming in protest. What was he doing? He was risking his own safety for what was likely a delusion, the instinct of a sick animal gone haywire. Maybe it had buried a bone here weeks ago, and its memory was failing. Maybe it was just digging to dig. He stopped, leaning heavily on his shovel, his breath tearing at his raw throat. "There's nothing here," he said to the dog, his voice laced with exhaustion and defeat. "You see? It's empty. We have to go. Now?" Before this storm gets worse, he looked at the dog, expecting to see it finally give up, to concede to the reality of the situation. But the dog's expression was one of heartbreaking desperation. It stood up on shaky legs, let out a sharp, pleading bark, and limped over to him. It ignored the shovel, ignored the wide pit he had dug. Instead, it pushed its nose insistently against his hand, then turned and nudged a small, undisturbed patch of snow just to the left of where he had been digging. It looked him directly in the eye, and whined again, a high, keening sound that vibrated with an unmistakable urgency. It wasn't a random spot. It was specific. Precise. It was a course correction. A jolt went through Mark, sharp and electric, cutting through his exhaustion. He had been working with brute force, clearing a wide area. The dog was telling him his method was wrong. It wasn't about clearing space, it was about reaching a single, exact point. He wasn't just digging for the dog anymore. He was digging with it. He was its hands, its tool. The animal's sheer, unwavering certainty washed away his own doubt. It knew. It knew what was down there, and it was trusting him, this stranger, to see it through. "Okay, girl," he whispered, his voice thick with a new emotion he couldn't quite name. It felt like awe. "Okay. I see you. I see you. Show me where." He dropped the shovel for a moment and knelt, his gaze following the dog's pointed nose. He was no longer a rescuer trying to save a stray. He was a partner in a desperate, sacred trust. The shift in his perspective changed everything. He was no longer fighting against the futility of the task, he was aligned with its purpose, even if he didn't understand it. He picked up the shovel again, his movements no longer broad and sweeping, but careful and precise. He focused on the exact spot the dog had indicated, a small, unassuming patch of snow no bigger than a welcome mat. The dog lay down a few feet away, its body trembling with either cold or anticipation, perhaps both. Its raw, bloody paws were tucked beneath its chest, but its eyes never left the hole. They were fixed on the moving shovel, tracking its every dip and rise. The sun had now vanished completely, leaving behind a bruised, purple twilight that was fading quickly to black. The wind had picked up, a mournful, shrieking thing that drove needles of ice into any exposed patch of his skin. He should have been terrified. Alone, in the dark, with a storm bearing down and his own energy reserves dangerously low. But a strange calm had settled over him. He was locked in this moment, in this shared mission. The world had shrunk to this small circle of disturbed snow, to the sound of his own breathing and the dog's soft whimpers. He felt a profound connection to the creature, a silent understanding that was more powerful than any spoken language. He was its hope, and it was his guide. Just a little longer, he murmured, the words snatched by the wind. Hold on. We're close. I can feel it. He didn't know why he said it, but he meant it. There was a change in the resistance beneath his shovel, a subtle shift in the density of the ground. He was no longer just chipping away at ice and frozen dirt. There was something else there. A few more careful scoops, and then it happened. The metallic clang he expected, the sound of shovel hitting rock, never came. Instead, there was a soft, dull thud. A yielding. It was a sound of something that had no business being buried 6 feet under the frozen ground. His heart hammered against his ribs. He dropped the shovel, the clatter of it falling against the icy earth shockingly loud. He fell to his knees, ignoring the biting cold that seeped instantly through his pants. The dog let out a sharp, excited yelp and crawled closer, its nose twitching, its whole body quivering. Mark dug with his bare hands now, his gloves too clumsy for this delicate work. The cold was excruciating, a searing pain that shot up his arms, but he barely noticed. He clawed at the frozen earth and snow, his fingers numb and clumsy, driven by a desperate, frantic urgency. He felt it again. Not rock. Not root. It was fabric. His fingers brushed against something soft, pliable. He pulled away a final layer of icy soil and there, in the dim, swirling darkness, he saw it. A flash of color. A small patch of bright, synthetic blue, a color that screamed of the human world, a color that was a flag of terrible wrongness in this wilderness of white and gray. He worked faster, his breath catching in his throat, a strangled, painful sound. The patch of blue became a sleeve. The sleeve became a shoulder. He cleared away the snow from a small, still form. It was a child's snowsuit. And inside it, there was a child. The world stopped. The wind, the cold, the burning in his lungs, it all faded into a deafening silence. For a long, horrifying moment, Mark could do nothing but stare. Curled in the frozen earth was a small child, no more than 5 or 6 years old. The boy was lying on his side, his face turned away, partially obscured by the hood of his bright blue snowsuit. He was perfectly, unnaturally still. A dusting of snow lay on his eyelashes like powdered sugar. Mark's mind reeled, struggling to process the impossible sight. All the dog's bizarre, obsessive behavior suddenly snapped into focus with brutal, devastating clarity. The frantic digging. The refusal of food. The unwillingness to leave this one, single spot. It hadn't been digging for shelter or for a meal. It hadn't been crazed or confused. It had been digging to save its person. This loyal, battered creature had been engaged in a desperate, one-animal rescue mission, trying to reach the small human it loved, who was trapped beneath the suffocating weight of the world. His heart, which had been pounding with exertion and adrenaline, now felt as if it had been encased in ice. He had been digging for an answer, and the answer was a nightmare. He reached out a trembling, numb hand, his fingers brushing against the child's cheek. The skin was colder than the snow itself. There was no response. No flicker of movement. He was too late. A wave of despair so profound it was physically nauseating washed over him. All this effort, all this hope, had been for nothing. The dog let out a long, sorrowful howl, a sound of pure, unadulterated grief that seemed to tear the night in two. It crawled forward and began to lick the child's frozen face, its whines low and heartbreaking. And then, in the absolute stillness of that tragic moment, Mark saw it. A tiny, almost imperceptible cloud of white vapor that bloomed for a second in front of the child's lips before being snatched away by the wind. A breath? The child was breathing. He was alive. The ice around Mark's heart shattered. The despair was replaced by a surge of adrenaline so powerful it made him dizzy. The mystery was solved, but the true crisis had just begun. This child was alive, but only just, hanging on by the most fragile of threads. Every second he remained out here in the killing cold, that thread was fraying. The race was on. He gently, carefully, worked his hands under the small, cold body, lifting the child from his frozen tomb. The boy was a dead weight, his limbs stiff, his body terrifyingly light. Mark immediately shrugged off his own heavy winter coat, the icy wind instantly biting at him through his sweater, and wrapped it tightly around the child. He had to get him to warmth. He had to get him to help. But help was miles away, across a treacherous landscape, in the middle of a gathering blizzard. He looked up, trying to get his bearings in the disorienting, swirling snow. His cabin felt a world away. His truck, parked near the old logging road, was closer, but still a brutal quarter-mile trek through thigh-deep snow. He wasn't sure he had the strength left to make it, let alone while carrying a child. He felt a wet nose push insistently against his hand. He looked down. The dog was on its feet, its posture transformed. The frantic energy was gone, the grief was gone. In their place was a sharp, focused intelligence. It looked at the precious bundle in Mark's arms, then looked out into the darkness in the direction of the road. It let out a short, sharp bark. It knew. It understood the urgency. Its job of digging was done, and now its job was to guide. It would lead them home. The journey back was a waking nightmare. The world had dissolved into a maelstrom of wind and driving snow. Mark could see no more than a few feet in front of him, a swirling vortex of white that seemed to press in from all sides. He held the child tight against his chest, trying to shield the small body with his own, a futile gesture against the overwhelming power of the storm. The boy remained limp and unresponsive, his life a fragile, precious weight in Mark's arms. Mark's own body was screaming in protest. His muscles, already pushed to their limit by hours of digging, were now seizing up with cold and strain. His lungs burned with every ragged breath. His mind, clouded by exhaustion, struggled to maintain a single, coherent thought, just one more step. And then another. He would have been lost in seconds, wandering in circles until he collapsed, but he was not alone. The dog, a dark phantom in the blizzard, was his compass. It stayed just ahead of him, a steady, unwavering presence. It would forge a path through the deepest drifts, looking back every few moments to ensure he was still following. When Mark stumbled, sinking to his knees in the heavy snow, the dog was there instantly, nudging his arm, barking with a frantic encouragement that cut through his daze. It was as if the animal was pouring its own life force, its own indomitable will to survive, directly into him. It was no longer just a dog, it was a lifeline, a guardian angel in a fur coat. They were a single unit, bound by a shared purpose, to get the boy to safety. The trek to the truck, a distance that would have taken him 5 minutes on a clear day, stretched into an eternity. Time lost all meaning. There was only the wind, the snow, the burning in his limbs, and the dark, guiding shape ahead. Finally, he saw it, the faint, blocky outline of his old pickup, almost completely buried in a drift. A sob of relief escaped his lips. They had made it. But the ordeal was far from over. He fumbled with the frozen door handle, his fingers clumsy and useless as blocks of wood. He finally managed to wrench it open and carefully laid the child on the passenger seat. The dog leaped in after, curling its body around the small, still form, a living blanket. Now came the final, crucial test. Mark slid into the driver's seat, his body trembling uncontrollably. He turned the key in the ignition. The engine gave a low, pathetic groan, the sound of frozen metal struggling against itself. "No," he whispered, his voice cracking. "No, no, please," he tried again. The same agonizingly slow churn. The battery was too cold, the oil thick as molasses. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through his exhaustion. To have come this far, to have found the boy, only to be stranded here, to freeze to death within sight of salvation, it was a cruelty beyond imagining. He closed his eyes and offered a silent, desperate prayer. He turned the key one last time, pumping the gas pedal with a frantic, rhythmic motion. The engine coughed. It sputtered. It caught, died, then caught again with a deafening roar, shaking the whole truck. They were saved. He threw the truck into gear and plowed through the snowdrift, back onto the barely visible track of the road. The drive to town was a white-knuckle blur. The windshield wipers fought a losing battle against the accumulating snow, and the truck skidded precariously on the icy surface. Beside him, the dog never moved. It remained a silent, watchful sentinel, its head resting gently on the child's bundled form, its warm breath helping to ward off the deadly cold. The fluorescent lights of the hospital emergency entrance were a blinding, heavenly glare after the suffocating darkness of the storm. Mark burst through the automatic doors, shouting for help, the small, blanket-wrapped child clutched in his arms. In an instant, he was surrounded by a flurry of motion. Nurses and doctors descended, their faces a mixture of shock and professional calm. A gurney appeared, and the child was whisked away from him, disappearing through a set of swinging doors with a terrifying finality. And then, he was alone. The chaos receded, leaving him standing in the middle of the brightly lit, sterile hallway, dripping melted snow onto the polished linoleum. The dog, which had followed him inside, pressed against his leg, its body still trembling. The sudden warmth of the building was a shock to their systems. Mark's exhaustion hit him like a physical blow, and his knees buckled. He slid down the wall to the floor, the adrenaline that had fueled him for hours finally deserting him, leaving behind a hollow, aching void. The dog lay down beside him, resting its head on his knee. They were a strange, pitiable sight, a man covered in frozen mud and sweat, and a blooded, matted dog, both of them staring at the doors that had swallowed the child. The waiting began. Every swing of the doors made his heart leap. Every disembodied voice over the intercom sent a jolt of anxiety through him. Time warped and stretched. Minutes felt like hours. He replayed the entire day in his mind, over and over. The digging. The frustration. The dog's insistence. The flash of blue fabric. The horrifying stillness of the child. The desperate, agonizing journey back. Had he been fast enough? Had he done the right thing? The weight of what if was a crushing burden. A nurse came by and offered him a warm blanket and a cup of coffee. She looked at the dog, then at Mark, her expression soft with a weary kindness. "He can stay," she said, before he could even ask. He's earned it. Mark wrapped the blanket around his shoulders, the warmth a small comfort against the deep, internal chill that had taken root in his bones. The dog, sensing his distress, licked his hand, a rough, warm touch that grounded him in the present. They were in this together, two exhausted sentinels keeping a silent, hopeful vigil. An hour passed. Then another. Finally, a doctor in green scrubs emerged from the swinging doors, his face tired but calm. He walked directly toward Mark. This was it. Mark's breath hitched. He pushed himself to his feet, his heart pounding a deafening rhythm in his ears. The doctor stopped in front of him, a gentle expression in his eyes. "He's going to make it," the doctor said, his voice quiet but clear. His core temperature was dangerously low, but we are warming him up slowly. He's stable. You got him here just in time. Another 30 minutes, well, let's not think about that. You saved his life. The words washed over Mark, and the tension that had held him rigid for hours finally broke. A strangled sob escaped his throat, and he sagged against the wall, his legs no longer able to support him. Relief, so pure and overwhelming, flooded through him, and he wept openly, burying his face in his hands. The dog, sensing the shift in emotion, stood up and began to lick his face, its tail giving a few weak thumps against the floor. The story came out in pieces later that night, assembled from the frantic reports of the local sheriff and the tearful, disjointed explanations from the boy's parents, who arrived at the hospital in a state of shock and disbelief. The family had been traveling through the mountains when their car had skidded on a patch of black ice and gone off the road, crashing into a deep ravine. The parents had been injured and disoriented. In the chaos and confusion that followed the crash, their 5-year-old son, Leo, had wandered away from the wreck, trying to find help. His loyal dog, a 2-year-old husky named Shadow, had gone with him. Leo, lost and frightened in the escalating storm, had eventually collapsed from exhaustion and cold. He had fallen into a shallow depression, and the relentless, drifting snow had quickly buried him. But Shadow had refused to leave his side. The dog had stayed with his boy, trying to keep him warm, trying to dig him out. For more than 24 hours, Shadow had stood guard, digging tirelessly, barking for a help he must have known would never come, a lone warrior fighting a battle against the entire force of winter. He was not just a pet, he was a guardian, a brother, a hero in the truest sense of the word. When Leo's parents finally saw Mark, their gratitude was a raw, powerful force. They embraced him, their tears soaking his shoulder. But their most profound emotions were reserved for the dog. When they saw Shadow, bruised and battered but standing proudly at Mark's side, they understood the full scope of the miracle. This incredible animal had not only saved their son's life, but had also led a stranger to him, bridging the gap between desperation and hope. The reunion between Leo and Shadow a few days later was a moment of pure, unadulterated joy. The little boy, now safe and warm in his hospital bed, threw his arms around the dog's neck, burying his face in its thick fur. Shadow responded with a flurry of happy yelps and loving licks, his whole body wiggling with a delight that was beautiful to behold. Their bond was a tangible thing, a light that filled the sterile hospital room. Watching them, Mark felt something shift deep within himself. The walls he had so carefully constructed around his heart began to crumble. He had sought solitude to escape the pain and complications of human connection, but this dog, this boy, this family, had shown him the one thing he had forgotten, that connection is not a complication, it is our salvation. In the weeks that followed, the snow melted, and the world re-emerged in the pale, hopeful green of early spring. Life returned to the mountains, and life returned to Mark. The story of the rescue had made him a local hero, a title he was deeply uncomfortable with. He insisted, to anyone who would listen, that he had done very little. The real hero was Shadow. The family, eternally grateful, wanted to reward him, but he refused any money. Instead, he accepted their offer of friendship. They had decided to stay in the small nearby town, unwilling to leave the place where their son had been given a second chance. They became a fixture in Mark's life, their warmth and laughter filling the quiet spaces he had once cherished as emptiness. He was no longer just a solitary man in a cabin, he was Uncle Mark, a beloved part of their found family. He saw Shadow often. The dog would greet him with a familiar, joyous bark, and the two of them would walk the trails along the now thawing creek, revisiting the spot where their lives had become forever intertwined. What began as a flicker of movement in a snowstorm, a simple act of curiosity, had become the defining moment of his life. It had been a journey into the heart of a blizzard that had led him, unexpectedly, back to the warmth of humanity. He had learned that true courage isn't about strength or solitude, it's about listening to the voiceless, about trusting an instinct you don't understand, and about being willing to step out into the storm for another. One evening, months later, Mark sat on his porch, watching the sun set behind the peaks. Shadow was lying at his feet, a comfortable, reassuring weight. The world was no longer silent, it was filled with the gentle sounds of life, of connection, of promise. He looked at the loyal dog, the creature who had stared into the face of utter hopelessness and refused to blink, and he understood. We are all, in our own way, digging in the snow for something we have lost or someone we love. And sometimes, the greatest gift we can receive is a helping hand, or a paw, to show us we are not digging alone. The connections we forge in the darkest of times are the ones that lead us back into the light. And if we are very lucky, they show us the way home.